All right. We're now delving into the chapter on the president. And there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the president. Some of the easier details, I'm just going to leave to you to look up. You can Google it, you can find it in your book, whatever. What I want to spend time on is kind of looking at some of the things that are not as easy to kind of wrap your brain around. And I want to make sure that you understand all the things a president can do, both formal and informal. So when you look at the president taking action, you can understand kind of the second layer of things going on, not just what's being said, but all the powers and all the responsibility and all the kind of collective understanding of that job description that lies underneath it. So the president has a lot of jobs. I've listed on our Google Doc all the different things, or on the board in class if this is a different semester. We've talked about all the things: chief diplomat, commander-in-chief, chief legislator, the chief executive, commander-in-chief. Oh, I already have commander-in-chief. Chief controller-in-chief, chief salesperson, lots of different jobs. Some of them formal, some of them are more informal, like chief salesperson. But today we're just going to look at three functions the president serves, which is chief diplomat, commander-in-chief, and chief legislator. So as the chief diplomat, the president, what that means is all negotiations with foreign countries take place through the president or a designee of the president, not Congress. The Senate can confirm treaties, ratify them, or not in the case of the Treaty of Versailles. But the president actually makes treaties and conducts negotiations. All the ambassadors, for every country, we have at least one ambassador. And I hope you know what an ambassador is. If not, stop the video, go Google what an ambassador is. But we have an ambassador to each country, and we have an ambassador from each country. Well, that's not entirely true. There are a few countries that we're not really friends with that we don't necessarily do ambassador things. But for the most part, we have ambassadors to countries. All the ambassadors work for the Department of State and work for the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is part of the president's cabinet and works for the president. So all negotiations with foreign powers, whether it be economic, whether it be military, trade, migration, aid, whatever, go through the president and the Department of State. They negotiate all those things. It is why they can make a whole movie series, or not movie, a whole TV series about the Secretary of State. It's called Madam Secretary. You should watch it. It's really good. If you watched it, you'd understand kind of how the U.S. conducts foreign policy and the president's role in that. But the president's chief diplomat, meaning that all treaties, all economic negotiations, everything start with and go through the president. And any official document that's created, whether that's a trade deal or a treaty, the president or an agent of the president, like I said, the ambassador's in charge. But the president has to sign off on it. It's the president that makes it. It then goes to the Senate for a vote if it's an official treaty. But there's something called an executive agreement. Which carries the weight of law and is almost as powerful as a treaty and does all the same things as a treaty, mostly, but doesn't require the Senate. If you understand executive orders, it's the same thing, but with treaties. It's a way for the president to do the things without involving Congress. So yeah, that's what an executive agreement is. It's a way to bypass Congress. They're not quite as powerful as a treaty, but they still carry the weight of law, and they're official. So the second, commander-in-chief. I'll go more into this later when we talk. No, actually, I'll do it now. So the commander-in-chief, the president is in charge of all the military because the Department of Defense, again, like the Department of State, is a cabinet-level department. They report to the president, meaning that the president can, and it actually says in the Constitution, the president shall be commander-in-chief of all armed forces. So what that means is that the president can send troops wherever. and say, listen, you know what? We're going to go blow this thing up, or we're going to send some soldiers here just to stand and look mean, or we're not going to send soldiers, or whatever. That's the president's prerogative. It's important to note that the congressional check on that is that the Congress has they control the budget for the military, and they are responsible for the maintenance of the military. But as far as the day-to-day operations of the military, that's the president as commander-in-chief through the Department of Defense, which the Secretary of Defense, who reports to them, are the secretaries of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Space Force. And they all report to the president. Another check that happened, because what was happening was the president was just sending troops all over the place for as long as they wanted, because Congress has to declare war. The president can't just say, we're at war with, Italy, whatever. What needs to happen is the president needs to get an official declaration of war from Congress in order for the funding to be available and for us to legally do some of the things that we need to do militarily. Get equipment, send troops, deploy, all that stuff. However, the president has in the past sent troops places for lengthy periods of time without an official declaration of war. Vietnam, there was no declaration of war ever. It was the president using some of his powers as commander-in-chief to effectively wage war without Congress's approval. As a result of specifically that, the Vietnam War, Congress passed something called the War Powers Act. Okay? And what the War Powers Act does is it requires the president to get congressional approval. A declaration of war requires declaration of war or something called an authorization for use of military force, AUMF, authorization for use of military force. And what that is just the Congress saying, you know what, go ahead, blow stuff up. It's not an official declaration of war, but it's congressional approval to do the war thing. And so the War Powers Act requires one of these two things from Congress within 30 days. So the president can send troops to screw around however for 30 days if they want, but then after that, the president's got to either get one of these or bring the troops home. And that's really important. All right, so the last one, the president's power as chief legislator. The president is not part of the legislature. That's Congress. The president can't make laws. That's Congress. However, the president does make recommendations to Congress through the State of the Union. The president does lobby Congress using the American people and say to the American people by giving a briefing or a press conference or whatever, the president would really like this bill. And that puts a ton of pressure on Congress to make that law. And short of that, what the president can do, and what's really important is if Congress fails to make a law or does not want to make a law and the president wants to take action, the president can issue what's called an executive order, which carries the weight of law, but is not quite as powerful as legislation. If Congress made a law, it would overwrite an executive order. But short of laws, the executive order does act like a law. The most famous one is Executive Order 9066, which is the Japanese internment. That was Franklin Roosevelt. Please, for the love of all that is good and fluffy, on the AP test, do not write about Executive Order 66. That is not... That's from Star Wars. Somebody did that on the AP test, and I don't want you to get Order 66 and Executive Order 9. Every time Executive Order 9066 mixed up. That's really it's happened before. Please don't do it. But another executive order that is worth mentioning is that Obama begged Congress to pass legislation about immigration reform, about specifically what the Republicans were calling at the time anchor babies, which is somebody who was born in America, but as a result of them being born in America, the parents who were illegal had to stay. And then also something the president wanted Congress to make legislation. President Obama wanted Congress to make legislation about children. What happens if a child is brought here at a very young age? And grew up here? They deported? I mean, that's it's something we're facing in society right now as a major problem. But so Obama asked Congress to do anything, but Congress didn't want to do anything because Congress was Republican, and if they passed legislation and Obama signed it, then that would not. They don't want immigration reform. They want no immigration whatsoever. So they didn't pass legislation, and Obama kept asking for it and kept asking for it. And he went to the press and he went to the public and said, Congress needs to write a bill. I'll sign it. And they never did. And he finally issued the what's called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, as you've probably heard of, which was legislation which dealt with the child immigrant issue and basically set in place a number of rules and regulations for what to do with children who had immigrated. And so that's still more or less, less now, but still more or less the policy. But if Congress ever wrote immigration reform, this would go away, because the legislation is more powerful than the executive order. But short of legislation, this executive order is what actually is law. And Obama passed a ton of executive orders because Congress didn't do anything. And when Trump became president, he passed a ton of executive orders undoing Obama's executive orders. That's the other problem with executive orders. They're undone by the next president. Executive orders have, at best, an 8-year lifespan. Congressional legislation can last for generations, which is another reason why legislation is better than executive orders, but it is an option for the president. All right.